Easter 1964 was a very, very important time in British broadcasting as it saw the real start of pop music broadcasting, some 6 or so years after teenagers had been sort of invented. It's strange but true to report that up until that time the BBC played very little pop music and then only those tracks that they themselves selected. But that was all to change from 1964 when the Pirates hit the airwaves. Now, I'm very pleased to tell you that we have one such pirate DJ in the studio with me today, Colin Nichol, who will be telling us all about the true story of pirate radio. Let's get into the swing of things with this track, the Radio Caroline theme from The Fortunes.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside. Come inside, the show's about to start. Guaranteed to blow your head apart. Radio Caroline.
Caroline by The Fortunes, whose tune was used as the main theme tune for Radio Caroline. And welcome to Colin Nichol, and thank you very much for giving up your time today.
It's a pleasure, Mike. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, as a matter of fact, because, it's a kind of sentimental time just at this present time. Caroline... Yes, did start on, it was actually Easter Saturday of 1964, but the actual date, because of course Easter is a movable feast, was March the 24th, itself the Saturday of Easter weekend in 1964, so there's always been a little bit of contention about when we celebrate the actual date. But there's quite a story, if you don't mind me just making the point.
Please do.
There's quite a story about that Fortunes record, because as soon as we started using it on Radio Caroline, the BBC banned it, wouldn't play it anymore, and that was no good news to my friend Terry King of the Terry King Agency in London, because he managed the Fortunes. And then the next step was that Decca Records, who issued the record of the Fortunes with Caroline, then withdrew it from production and circulation, and it was a banned record. But we had the copies on Caroline, so we continued to use it. I think it's a rousing, exciting theme.
I think it's ideal.
You know, thump, 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 Caroline, Caroline. It happened to be coincidental, absolutely coincidental, that the record was released early 1964, around the same time as Caroline was launched. It was completely unintentional.
So it wasn't written for...
No, nothing to do with it at all.
Oh, I had made some assumption that the actual record was written specifically for the ship.
No, the ship took the record on.
Oh, right.
It was just one of those lucky coincidences for us, but not so good for the Fortunes. But they still had tremendous exposure, and of course they did very well out of the fact that it was their record and their name, and the record was played on Caroline anyway. But it was one of several uses of the name Caroline at the time. Now, the founder of Radio Caroline, who decided that he would name the ship after Caroline Kennedy, who was 6 years old at the time. Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of the President of America. And that's not itself a true story. I'll tell you in a minute the true story behind that. But this is what he told everybody. And Caroline Kennedy herself had several other famous items named after her. One of them was the Neil Diamond song, Sweet Caroline. And the other was the President Kennedy's personal aircraft, which he named Caroline. And a yacht was named after Caroline as well. So Caroline Kennedy, she's now Caroline Schlossberg Kennedy, and a very well-known writer and political identity, I suppose I have to say, because she started to try to get into politics recently and failed. But that's the story behind the name Caroline and behind the record Caroline, and I'll tell you more secrets in a moment.
But you didn't start, of course, on Radio Atlanta and Radio Caroline. You actually started here in Perth, where you were born.
Yes, that's right. Back 57, back in the dark ages of radio, black and white photographs and records at 78.
That's excellent. And then we'll play a bit of music now, but then in 1963 you moved to the UK and met a fellow Australian, Alan Crawford, and that's where it all really started, I suppose. Let's have a little bit of music, which is your theme song that you used on Radio Atlanta. Trio and Ensemble, which I think was your signature tune on Atlanta. But let's go back to talking about Caroline, though, just for a second.
Yes, I wanted to just follow up on something I hinted at a moment ago. I dropped a hint earlier, and I should just clarify, if I may, Mike, and that is that although Ronan O'Reilly, who was the founder of Radio Caroline, to begin with the naming of Caroline, there's a very clear and I believe quite proven story that in his early days, before he became involved with pirate radio, he was a bit of a small-time entrepreneur, plugging records, as we say, that is to say, promoting discs around London to the radio stations and so on. He was also involved to a certain degree in the management of certain artists, including Georgie Fame, though he was only very peripherally involved in that. And he was at parties where he met quite a few people in entertainment and show business and so on, because he was a would-be actor himself and had an actor's studio at one stage and was spending time socially with actors. And during all of that, he met a young lady named Caroline Maudling, who was about 17 or 18 at the time. We're talking about 1963. And Caroline was the daughter of the Chancellor of the Exchequer of Great Britain, that is to say, the Treasurer of Britain, so, Reginald Maudling. Caroline apparently met Ronan, and they reputedly dated a few times. And Ronan did say to one of my colleagues that he'd named the ship after Caroline Maudling. I have it pretty well firsthand. So it was really Caroline Maudling, and then he denied that and came up with a convoluted story about seeing a photograph of Caroline Kennedy in a magazine when he was flying back from America one day. And because she was disturbing business in the White House at the time by crawling around under the president's desk, that is, he decided that it was an ideal name for a ship that would be disturbing Britain and disrupting Britain. Well, the story's not entirely correct, but it's a variation on what actually happened. It was young John Kennedy.
It's a nice story if you have to change midstream. Yes,
changed from John Kennedy, the baby, John, to Caroline. I've got the photographs of John under the president's desk, so I have the black and white proof of it. And a lot of research was done about the real naming of it. This was I'm spending a little time on it. People are probably wondering why, but it was a matter of great contention at the time.
Yes. Going back to Atlantos, because that's where you started, and you started with a gentleman called Alan Crawford.
Yes.
Now, why did Alan Crawford actually want to start a radio station?
This is the real story. I bumped into a friend. In fact, my girlfriend at the time actually was interviewed by somebody from Australia who was doing interviews of Australians working abroad. She was Australian. And she introduced me to this man, and this was a man named Ken Evans. Ken had bumped into a man named Alan Crawford, whom he knew from Sydney. Alan was head of Southern Music in Sydney, a very, very major music publishing company worldwide. Alan had come over to Britain via continental Europe, where he was working, representing Southern music in Europe and then in London. And he'd set up his own companies, recording pop tunes, cover versions mostly, of current hits, because, after all, not all the American catalogue or overseas catalogue of songs was ever broadcast or even recorded in Britain. It was very restricted as to what was recorded and what was broadcast. So there was a wide open market for making cover versions of recognised and established hits in America which hadn't made it in England, and getting them distributed in England through mail order and through department stores and various ways and means. And this is what Alan was doing, in addition to his more lucrative publishing business in other areas. Alan had tried to get records played on Radio Luxembourg and the BBC starting about 1959. He became very frustrated in a meeting in 1960 with BBC executives. He was asked would he like to join members of the Pilkington group who were putting together, the Pilkington Committee, who were putting together a report which was later called the Pilkington Report on Broadcasting, which, after 2 years of very careful conjugation and much heart-searching and hand-wringing, decided that the broadcasting situation in Britain did not need to be changed.
Now, Alan had his own label, didn't he?
Yes, he did, several of them. And these were, as I said, the ones that were distributed by various means, but the official record distribution networks in Britain would not distribute for him because they were all part of this great hands in each other's pockets sort of monopoly that was in existence in Britain at the time. The music publishers were hand in glove with the record companies, who were hand in glove with the broadcasters, who were hand in glove with the Performance Rights Association and so on, Performance Rights Society at the time. It was all very much a closed shop, and there was no way he could get his records played on the BBC. Radio Luxembourg was the only other option, broadcasting from 350-odd kilometres away in the middle of Europe, just about, middle of Western Europe, where I worked later on. And that was hard to get into because the record companies controlled that. So Alan came up with an answer, but it was an answer that wasn't originally his. A lady named Kitty Black, who was a contemporary age, I suppose, a little older than Alan. Alan was born in 1932. And Kitty was an expatriate from South Africa, but a more English lady you would not meet, and she was very well educated, very clever lady, multilingual, a very talented concert musician. She's in a museum now, I should think. And she was very very alert and very sharp. And on one of her trips to Europe, she heard about Radio Mercury. She heard about this. It was set up by a millionaire Texan broadcaster. I'm casting my mind back 45 years. I'm a little hesitant.
Yes.
And this man, an American, was behind Radio Mercure, but Kitty heard about this, told Alan, because they'd become friends, and that's how Alan heard about it. And so he said, this is my answer, and they set about creating a radio station. Now, Radio Mercure was going to be closed down and moved back to Galveston, Texas, because things were getting a bit sticky with the authorities in Sweden and particularly in Denmark, which is where it was broadcasting to, basically. And he decided that it wasn't worth the biscuit, and he'd get out and close the station down. Alan made an almost successful attempt to buy the ship and then tried to rent it. If that had happened, we'd have been on the air with Radio Atlanta, which is what he called it, in 1960 or at the latest 1961.
Okay, let's have a break there then and listen to one of the three 45s you lent me on the Carnival label, which was Alan Crawford's label. And I reckon this is going to be a song called Sticks and Stones by the Westminster Five, Westminster Five. And I reckon this probably might be the very first time it's been aired in Australia. It could well be.
Probable.
Yes.
It's a specially written song from a studio-created group.
Right, here we are then. The Westminster Five on the Carnival label, which was Alan Crawford's label, entitled Sticks and Stones.
Shame. I've been abused. Oh, right from my heart. I've been abused. Yeah, been abused right from the start. People talk about pictures up. And know I love you so. I don't care what the people might say. I'll never let you go. Come on now, yeah.
Well, that's a 45-year-old 45. Sticks and Stones from the Westminster Five.
There seems to me, Mike, to be more nefarious goings on behind the scenes with pirate radio. In fact, there were, than ever were going on aboard ships or even when we knocked off and went ashore. There was a good deal of unpleasantness going on. And it was to do with who was going to be first on air, and who was going to be first here and there, and get all the glory and the money and all the rest of it. Alan, as we've been talking about, Alan Crawford, I met through Ken Evans. I mentioned him a moment ago. He'd bumped into Alan in the street, coincidentally, not very long before he bumped into me, and Ken and I remembered that we had met years before in Sydney during one of my outings over there on a disc jockey convention, and we had lots of friends in common. So he didn't say anything to me at the time. This is September of '63, But he rattled back to Alan Crawford and said, "Alan, you'd said to me earlier this year when we bumped into one another in Shaftesbury Avenue that you were thinking of starting a pirate radio station and that you were quite a long way along the way of doing that. And you wanted to know about anyone I could think of who might be available, who had experience as a disc jockey, or who even was an Australian who could go on the air, so that we could escape any of the kind of legal actions that might be taken against anybody involved in this if they were British national. But being Australian, of course, we could probably be a little bit away from the danger of all of that, of being arrested or being prohibited in some way. So that accounts for a certain amount of the Australian content of pirate radio in Britain. But Alan said to Ken, "This fellow, you mean he's been on radio for 5 years in Australia and he's very experienced and all that? He's ideal. Tell him yes." So for that reason, I became the first to be officially appointed in September of '63 of anybody in pirate radio. There was a little lapse of time before the ship was to be ready for broadcast. It was going to be sent off to a port in Ireland, Southern Ireland, port called Grenore on the Irish Sea, just in the shadow of the Mountains of Mourne, so to speak, to be fitted out with its mast. That was the hardest part of the whole thing. What Alan had done is take that ship that had been Radio Mercure and which had gone back to Galveston, Texas, brought it back via Spain, and couldn't step the mast in Spain because he didn't want to sail it across the Bay of Biscay and across the Channel and so on, up to its mooring place off Essex, just north of the Thames, because of the danger of the mast being snapped along the way. Of course, the seas are very rough in those parts. So he sailed the ship without its mast to Grenore, and the mast was to be stepped there. Eventually, Caroline set sail, ostensibly to go to a northern mooring off from Liverpool, well, actually off the Isle of Man, in effect, leaving us to go south when we were finally fitted out to moor where Caroline South was always intended, or at least Radio Atlanta was always intended. We were still Radio Atlanta and Radio Caroline separately. So Caroline went off, but instead of turning left out of Grenore, turned right and went round the south of England and moored where we were supposed to be. They'd also got use of our crystals, so the broadcasting crystals for the transmitter, so their frequency was the one that we were going to be using. But they weren't aware of the exact location to moor. That had been kept secret, because it was very important. There are sandbanks, tides, and really great maritime hazards in the English Channel anywhere, and especially around where we were to be moored, which was roughly off Frinton-on-Sea, Essex. And, well, not quite there, but that's an identifying point, and a bit south of Harwich. So we at least had that secret to ourselves, but nothing else, and we weren't first on air. So when we finally got ourselves organised, it was a couple of months later, because we'd had a very big setback and sailed around the south coast. The mast came off just off Portsmouth and was re-stepped. We just sailed in and had it re-stepped, and the authorities, by the time they found out, it was too late.
Well, that seems a good point to break for another bit of music. Cast Your Weight to the Wind.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline.
Cast Your Fate to the Wind from Sounds Orchestral got to number 5 in December 1964.
So Atlanta finally went on the air, but by which time, of course, it was, the afterthought, which was rather sad for all of us, because Alan Crawford and Kitty had come up with the concept. They had made it happen. They'd created the ship. They'd done all the research, got the legal opinion, set up all the cross-indexed, so to speak, companies around the world to support the operation, got a team together, and then suddenly had it all whisked away from under their nose. When I first encountered Radio Atlanta, they were building a studio in the top of a building in the middle of Soho, central London, which is where Alan had his music publishing and other interests. And going up there to the top floor, there was a hive of activity of carpentering and so on, electrical work, and they were building a studio. And what we did in the early stages, while waiting for the ship to be finished and to moor in its location, was recording all the programs in advance with time checks. The whole thing was all calculated to a very short period of few seconds, so that when we played the tapes again on the ship, the time calls would be as near accurate as possible. It was quite a tricky thing to do, but therefore we had breakfast programs, which was what I was doing, which was to have been the first program on air on pirate radio, and it never happened that way. So you're speaking to someone who was supposed to be the first pirate on the air in Britain, and of course I came very bad third or fourth or whatever it was. But
the first on Atlanta.
Oh yes. That's true. It was supposed to be the first of all. And so we recorded all these programs, and we had loads and loads of them. So we had days and days and even several weeks of programming already lined up well before we ever went on the air. These tapes were, when we finally moored the ship in the proper location, which was the better one, better than Caroline's anyway. We had to ship these tapes then in large boxes down through a little port called Brightlingsea onto a sand barge. It took 5 hours, 6 hours to get out to the ship from there. It was really painful. And these two funny little fellows who were running the sand barge, no offence meant to them, but they sat there rugged up in their coats, quietly drinking tea for 5 or 6 hours, while the rest of us froze to death because we were standing on this open barge, guarding these tapes in these boxes. And we started off playing them, but it soon became evident on Atlanta that it wasn't going to be a good idea in the long run. So a temporary studio was quickly lashed together on the ship, and another of my colleagues, Dermot Hoy, he was known as Brian Vaughan in those days. Lots of people changed their names for safety's sake in case they would be lined up for arrest when they got ashore. And he and I went aboard along with some others, and we started doing live broadcasts then, and reading commercials live, which had never been done before.
Now, I've got a story which I was going to put in later on because I think it was in your days on Caroline. And I got it from this book, the Keith Skew's book, Pop Went the Pirates. And in there, there's a story that when you were, Keith says, a duty announcer, the take-up reel of a tape player jammed, and you had to pull the tape through, Keith says, for 27 minutes. Adjusting the speed manually as you put the tape past the head.
Yes, indeed. Well, they were the old TIAC. They're still around. I've got one at home. TIAC recorders, 10-inch reels of tape on them.
Oh yes.
And they were very efficient, wonderful, advanced tapes. They were the sort of the cheaper Japanese version of Ampex, which was the byword in those days. And TIAC was very good. As long as you kept the tape flowing through the heads, you didn't need the take-up spool. So it was a case of steadying it as it went through, just very gently and very carefully.
For 27 minutes, that's...
well, I was younger then.
Thank goodness for the days. The days now have CDs. Here's another bit of music. Jerry and the Pacemakers got to number 8 in December 1964.
Caroline, the sound of the nation.
Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline!
Life goes on day after day. Hearts torn in every way. So ferry cross the Mersey, 'cause this land's the place I love, and here I'll stay. People, they rush everywhere, each with their own secret care. So ferry cross the Mersey and always take me there, the place I love. People around every corner, they seem to smile and say, we don't care what your name is, boy, we'll never turn you away. So I'll continue to say, here I always will stay. So ferry cross the Mersey, 'cause this land's the place I love, and here I'll stay, and here I'll stay, here I'll stay.
Jerry and the Pacemakers, ferry across the Mersey. And Colin was telling me while we were off air how melodic he found that particular.
Oh, it was always a great favourite. It was one of those songs. Of course, it was a Merseyside song, and the Beatles had already established by then. So anything from the Mersey was pretty well, from Liverpool was pretty well accepted straight off. But it was slightly out of context with some of the rock and pop that was going on, because music at that time was really still in the reaction period after having so many years of, and they're very good performers, but people like Vaughan Monroe and Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald are the greatest performers, but these were ballads and middle-of-the-road stuff, and of course there was a kind of immediate reaction once the Pirates started into more rock and pop stuff, slightly heavier, and then along came Jerry and the Pacemakers, and some others like them. Jonathan King, Everyone's Gone to the Moon, was another one. We have that later on.
Yeah, we do, I hope, yes.
And so on, and they were kind of suddenly out of context, and they helped to, I suppose, moderate the whole feeling of the music and give it a very melodic feel, which was so very important in the 60s music. It was melody, there was beat as well, very often, but there was melody. I ask you to look for melody in the music today. Don't get me on that.
Now, you said earlier on that the whole matter of pirate radio was very, very complex, and there were side issues and skullduggery. Tell us about the day that Caroline actually sailed over to Atlanta, the first time you...
Oh, yes. Well, we'd been broadcasting a couple of months, and it was plain that nobody was winning the battle of the boats, so to speak. I hate them being called boats, they were ships. But certainly we were competing and nobody was winning. And, well, in fact, I take that back. I have it on the best authority, and I've looked up all the best records, and it is true, it is absolutely true, that Radio Atlanta was winning the battle because, you see, we had more professional people aboard. And we had a more professional approach. We had program director, we had experienced announcers, many of whom I'd trained, and we were actually putting out a very much more professional product. And the advertising agencies, some of the biggest advertising agencies in Britain, were saying, we have to go with one or the other, and it looks like Atlanta. Now, Jocelyn Stevens, who owned Harper's Bazaar and Queen magazines in London, very major magazines, was a shareholder in Ronan O'Reilly's Radio Caroline. So Ronan was sent off with a flea in his ear to tell Alan. Now, Alan Crawford didn't know this at that time, and he was running out of money. So Ronan bluffed him into going into a merger. We didn't know this on board Radio Atlanta. Nobody had bothered to tell me. I was the chief announcer running the ship and doing air shifts and responsible for looking after the ship. And one fine day, looking over the starboard bow, there was Radio Caroline, the MV Fredericia, sailing across our bows. So, stunned disbelief at first, of course. We're being raided, everybody said. They're coming to take us over, they're coming to board us. So we locked all the doors and hid the crystals, the spare transmitter crystals, and locked the studio, and I bravely stood on the deck and waited for them to approach. Well,
Repel all borders.
Yes, we're in international waters. We could have been boarded. It was an act of piracy, but and we were both legitimately registered ships and all that. But nobody was going to come to our rescue. I can't remember. I don't think we couldn't have come. The two ships couldn't have come alongside because they were too. It's too dangerous. So there must have been a tender boat come between us, a lifeboat sent between us, and Simon D came aboard. Now Simon was the most famous of all the pirates because he was the first on air on Radio Caroline, and I'd trained Simon in those studios in Soho on the top floor of Alan Crawford's offices where he'd had the studio built, because they'd all come for training, he and a few others, because they were going to start tape recording programs as well for our operation. Or by then we knew that they had theirs, but they were going to the north of England and we were going to the south, so we didn't really have a terrible problem about that.
No conflict, no.
Yes, we might have not have been first, or we may have been, but we would have been in the south of England, which is where the money was. And so I trained them, so of course I knew Simon quite well. And I'm not sure we hadn't seen one another ashore anyway by then. Simon came on and said, we've merged. So I said, well, nobody's told me. Off went a telex message to shore. We had trouble with ship-to-shore communications a little later on. At that time we still had some, because after a while the government banned us from ship-to-shore communications on any official channel. So back came the message, yes, we've merged. Simon is taking over. Come ashore, Colin, we'll brief you. So Simon came aboard and started broadcasting from the Radio Atlanta ship, and we started calling ourselves Radio Caroline.
So there was no actual close-down ceremony of Atlanta. So Atlanta
one to the other. We must have continued broadcasting as Atlanta for a little while. Yes, we did, because Radio Caroline, minus Simon, and I think it was probably somebody like Tom Lodge, who was then senior announcer, would then sail right around the coast of Britain, from just above the Thames estuary off the coast of Essex, all the way around the south coast and all the way up the east coast to more 3.5 miles off the Isle of Man, sort of between the Isle of Man and north east England, Liverpoolish way.
Yes.
And that journey was famous because they broadcast all the way round and asked everybody at night to come out onto the coast and turn on their car headlights. And the whole of the coast of Britain was illuminated with car headlights. It was astonishing.
Brilliant. Oh, absolutely wonderful. Let's have a little bit more music. The person we're going to play now, we're going to play two tracks together. One is by Twinkle, and I believe that Twinkle
everybody jokes with me about Twinkle. We were supposed to
to
be an item. Not quite.
But she actually
was
did come on board, didn't she?
She did, yeah, she's a sweetie. And I thought, oh, she's a sweet little thing. She's only about 3 years old or something. Actually, I think she was 17. And all this, back-combed hair, blonde hair, and she was sweet and bouncy, and she had a relatively appalling record, and we all loved her, and she was great.
Yeah, here's that appalling record. Twinkle with Terry. Got to number 4 in November, 64.
Oh, yes, and she was great with it.
He said to me he wanted to be near to me. He said he never wanted to be out of my sight. but it's too late to give this boy my love tonight. Please wait at the gate of heaven for me, Terry. He said to me he wanted to be close by my side. We had a quarrel, I was untrue on the night he died. And it's too late to tell this boy how great he was. Please wait at the gate of heaven for me, Terry. He rode into the night, accelerated his motorbike. I cried to him in fright, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. He said to me, you are the one I want to be with. He said to me, you are the one whom my love I shall give. One day he'll know how hard I prayed for him to live. Please wait at the gate of heaven for me, Terry. He rode into the night, accelerated his motorbike. I cried to him in fright, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. He said to me, you are the one I want to be with. He said to me, you are the one whom my love I shall give. One day he'll know how hard I prayed for him to live. Please wait at the gate of heaven for me, Terry. Terry.
I know all there is to know about the crying game. I've had my share of the crying game. First there are kisses, then there are sighs, and then before you know where you are, you're saying goodbye. One day soon I'm gonna tell the moon about the crying game. And if he knows, maybe he'll explain why there are heartaches, why there are tears, and what to do to stop feeling blue when love disappears.
The Crying Game, Dave Berry, number 5 in August 64.
Where did we leave off?
I can't remember. We had 2 tracks there, Twinkle and Dave Berry.
That's right, yes. Well, Caroline had just sailed around the coast.
That's right,
Yes,
right.
that's
So,
right,
so
yes.
now you had become Caroline, not Atlanta.
And then we were Caroline, yes. And we all moved from our little studios and offices in the middle of Soho to a very grand building in Mayfair, just off Park Lane, which was renamed Caroline House. It had about 27 floors, I think it seemed that many. Huge basement where we had studios and production facilities and what was called a traffic department where they put together all the advertisements and announcements that had to be broadcast in a very professional way with a very large schedule. And that was all quite professional down there on the basement. Everything from the basement, above the basement, from the ground floor up, was unprofessional, which was where the offices were and the management and all the rest, and the boardroom and so on. It was very badly mismanaged. It was a wonderful project, very badly run by people who had no idea what they had in there. They had a tiger by the tail. They didn't know how to deal with it. With Alan Crawford, I think we probably could have got somewhere with it all because he had a very professional management team and a program director who had the experience and people like myself who had broadcasting
And did
experience.
Alan maintain some sort of input into...
He maintained a partnership with Ronan, but it wasn't ever a balanced partnership because Ronan had placed Alan under a very great deal of pressure, and he was really concerned and really outdone in manoeuvrings and all sorts of jiggery-pokery that went on. And in the end, at the end of 1965, after about 18 months of this very uncomfortable relationship, he sold out to Ronan and got out, sadly. But he wasn't up to what was going on. It was just beyond his abilities to cope with it all.
And of course, around this time, there was actually, I was going to say a murder, and of course it wasn't a murder because he was acquitted. But there was a death from a guy being killed by a shotgun, wasn't there?
Yes, it was another convoluted story. At one stage, Alan had decided, just turn the clock back a bit, in early 64, before we went on the air, I had dinner with with Alan one evening and said to him, Alan, I think you should, because we know now what Ronan's up to, we should go on one of the forts in the Thames estuary, concrete and steel forts built in the estuary of the Thames, more than 3 miles off the coast, outside territorial limits, enormous structures, built to carry 20, 30 men, huge anti-aircraft, anti-vessel, anti-ship guns, enormous defences built during the Second World War in the event to be used in the event of an invasion across the Channel, an invasion of Britain by the Nazis. And fortunately, they were hardly used in war. I suppose they might have been used to shoot down try to shoot down some of the rockets that went over, of course, aimed for London from Germany, but essentially they were not used for the original intention because there was no invasion, but they were left just deserted by the Ministry of Defence and left to rot. Well, they weren't rotting, they were too well built. And they were standing there, half a dozen or so of them, several of them. And I said to Alan, use one of those. And he nearly fired me for all that interference in his affairs, which goes to show how Alan was really not quite in touch with the whole thing. He was also out of his depth. He'd taken on something which was enormous, and he didn't know how to handle it. And the rest of us did, quite frankly, we did, because, I'd had experience in broadcasting. I knew what we were doing. I knew how it should... I'm saying that. That's all very well for me to say it now. I said it at the time. We know what to do, how to do it. Let us do it. And that nearly got me turfed out. But the whole thing is that he didn't do it then. But later he decided he would. Now, somebody had already started using one of these forts. I forget which one it was. There were several, as I said. And
was this the Screaming Lord Such guy?
Screaming Lord Such had it first. Yes. And then Reg Culvert took it over. He was an entrepreneur musician, but not the trumpet player, as many people get him confused with that Eddie Culvert, I think he was, wasn't he? But Culvert decided, Reg Culvert, that he would amalgamate with Caroline, with Caroline South. Alan was going to carry on as Radio Atlanta in association with this existing pirate radio fort in the estuary, but he was not satisfied, and it was going to be basically a good music station, pleasant music, and it was going to be aiming at the big money in the City of London. So they needed a better transmitter. The one that was there was only a few thousand watts, but there was an enormously good signal from those forts because they were stationary in water in the middle of the Thames estuary, but 3.5 miles off. And if there's one way you want to get good promulgation of a medium wave signal, it is to sit the transmitter in water or on water, because you get an enormous reflection of the signal and a very good ground wave. So this was really the answer, and that's why I said to Alan in the first place we should have been doing it, because we could have beat Caroline on the air from there and get the ship later on. Alan was too frightened because he was dealing with investors' money and he was not going to take that risk. Should have done it, but it's 45 years too late to say it to him again. He died in the December of 1999. So I understand the story second-hand, but I know it thoroughly, or near enough. Alan and his colleague Kitty Black sent a 10-kilowatt transmitter out there and some other equipment, loaded aboard the fort, and Reg decided that he would use it but not pay us for it, pay Alan for it. So that then started a tremendous furore. Kitty Black, redoubtable to the end, along with some others, organised a raiding party on that fort. At the time there was a strike in the Port of London, so there were plenty of heavies from the port area to go with them on a small vessel out to the fort, climb aboard, up the step ladder, the ladder fixed to the side, and be on her and in the studios and in the accommodation before anybody on the fort knew they were there. Took it over, took the crystals, the transmitter crystals, and the station went off the air. And then the raiding party left, leaving a small party aboard on the fort to maintain control. Well, Reg Calvert, when he heard about this, went absolutely berserk. Apparently was reputedly an unstable man anyway. Met with Alan and Kitty at the offices in Soho, threatened to kill them with a gas gun, threatened to drop gas canisters on the fort and kill everybody on the fort, all sorts of stuff. And, who were the real pirates?
Yes.
And so then he went to the home of the chief director of Alan's company, Oliver Smedley, who was a very well-known, he was a retired major, very outstanding war record, and a very well-known city businessman in London, a figure of the establishment. Went to his house in the country and pulled a gun on him. This was the short part of the story. The longer part is that he beat the door down. The only person in the house at the time was Oliver Smedley's secretary, come assistant, come live-in partner, but in those days you didn't sort of say it in quite those words.
Yes.
His wife was either divorced or living elsewhere, I forget now. And he was in the house next door, so June Thorburn called him in, and he came in and he wasn't armed, he thought he was armed. And when he came in, he saw Reg throwing something at June Thorburn, his secretary, who was standing on the steps. And in an involuntary action, so the story goes, bumped the shotgun he had in his hand, because he picked up the gun. There was a lot of going up and downstairs and disconnecting of telephones and people in and out the door and the door being broken.
Yes.
And nobody really clearly remembers what happened. The end result was that Reg Calvert was dead within moments on the floor of Oliver Smedley's country cottage. So a long, over several months, court case. He was accused of murder. Well, of course, there was no case for murder because there was a case for self-defence, and then he broke into the home, and at that stage the Englishman's home, his castle philosophy still had a good deal of weight.
Yes.
These days, of course,
Not.
it's not the case, but he had invaded the man's home and assaulted someone and broken the door down, and so shooting him was not really too much out of court. And speaking of court, of course, the court came down with a verdict of not guilty, and that was, except for the echoes of that scandal and that story, that was about the end of that episode, but it was also the end of Alan's attempts to get a radio station on the air.
It's a nice bit sort of woven into the tapestry of the
yes.
pirate radio days.
Well, others died. A couple of boys from one of the forts were drowned, and also the owner of that radio station was drowned as well. So lives were lost in the course of
not all good fun. And
and the seas were pretty horrendous at times. I mean, some of those gales, the waves were just crashing over the deck of the ship above, and you would be down below thinking, well, it's been fun.
That's a good time to have a break for a bit of more music. Here's the singing version of the theme tune that I use for my programme, that I sort of borrowed from Keith Screws in the UK. Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds, number 1 in June 65.
Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline, the sound of the land. Caroline, the sound of the nation. Caroline. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you. Take me for a trip upon your magic swirling ship. All my senses have been stripped, and my hands can't feel to grip, and my toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. I'm ready to go anywhere. I'm ready for to fade onto my own parade. Cast your dancing spell my way. I promise to go under it. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there ain't no place I'm going to. Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. In the jingle jangle morning, I'll come following you.
Well, we finished the last section with a sort of murder and a few deaths. What was it actually like on board the boat? What did the duty day consist of?
We were very busy. The thing is that I suppose the most consistent thing was the noise of the generators, which never left us, and the vibration that accompanied it. So we could be pretty tired at the end of a couple of weeks of trying to sleep and trying to work with that in the background. It wasn't so noticeable in the studio, of course. The vibration was, but not the noise. It couldn't be noticeable. We had to counter that. But it was everywhere else, and so I remember that always feeling a little bit under par, pushing hard to be bright and cheerful on the air. But essentially, we were always busy. You do your shift, which could be 4 hours, or 3 or 4 hours. Somebody was always popping in and popping out just to see if you needed something, or to bring you a record or whatever. But there were schedules, and there were changes to the schedule sometimes, and an ad would be brought in at short notice. But at the end of the 4 hours, in the case of people like myself, I would then go on to do a few hours of shift doing the news. And that meant listening to our news sources and monitoring them in various ways. I'd arranged with one of the technicians to get a Reuters radio receiver. Reuters broadcast their news, Reuters, one of the big worldwide news agencies, broadcast their news by radio, by wireless. But you could only pick it up with a very special receiver and a machine to print out what it was transmitting. And I managed with one of the technician friends to get hold of one of those and install it in the studio, in the news studio. And so that chatted away, printing out Reuters news, which meant between that, and I had us tuned into, because I was very news-oriented at that time as I am now, and I had us tuned into, in those days there was no CNN, of course, but there was Voice of America, and we could listen to Voice of America on shortwave. So between those two sources and monitoring various medium wave broadcasts from the mainland of Britain, we were able to get a very good comprehensive cover of news. And in fact, our news was very often an hour or more ahead of the BBC. So we were doing pretty well with that, but it meant a bit of work and a bit of time. So I did that and typed up the news. One of the days that I was sitting there typing with the typewriter in front of me, sitting much as I am now, I leaned back just a little to take a breath and stretch my back, because it was, like a couple of hours into the shift. I was sitting at the table in my cabin, and something whistled past where my head had been at very high speed. It was a full can of Heineken thrown at immense strength, and it embedded into the wall of the insulated wall, thick insulation of the wall of the bulkhead of the cabin. Had my head been where it was a split second before, I'd have been very badly injured, if not killed. It was the chief engineer, he'd gone crazy.
Oh, truth. We'll break in here because I've got a very short clip that I've just advanced my CDs here. A very short clip of you actually reading the news.
Oh, yes.
I think it was on Radio Caroline.
Yes, here's where I go red in the face.
Yeah. Would you might better even tell us when it was? Here it is.
From the international, national, regional, and local scene. News on the hour, every hour, over 199 Radio Caroline.
Colin Nichol reporting.
North Sea. Divers on board ships in the North Sea are preparing now to go down to see if the sunken oil rig Sea Gem can be recovered. 9 men are still missing, and an inquiry into the cause of the disaster opened today. London, along with other members of the royal family, Her Majesty the Queen has been attending a special service at Westminster Abbey this morning to inaugurate the Abbey's 900th anniversary year. Washington, the American State Department is refusing to comment on reports that the reason for the pause in American bombing of North Vietnam is the hope of encouraging peace talks. London, because of frost, many Southern Region trains have been delayed today up to 3/4 of an hour, some of them, and others have been cancelled. Racing, all of today's 4 race meetings are off because of the weather. 4 of today's league soccer matches are off, those at Southampton, Peterborough, Brentford and Workington. There's a long list of rugby cancellations as well. Roads in more than half the counties of Britain have been affected today by ice, snow or freezing fog. The weather forecast for today until midnight, dry and sunny but with temperatures not above freezing in many places. Scattered showers in some coastal districts. Patches of freezing fog and icy, dangerous roads. The outlook for Wednesday and Thursday becoming less cold generally, with temperatures rising to near normal. Rain in most areas, snow in the north.
Well, not the best of quality, maybe, but does that bring
Not
back
the
some
best
memories?
not the best of weather either.
Standard UK weather.
I wondered how we were on the ship at that time. I gave myself away there. I said Jim instead of Jem, so there was still some of the Australian in my voice. Yes, it must have been a nasty day. I don't remember when it was. 65, sometime.
Yeah, and that news you got from which source? I mean, you collected it
Yes,
off
from those-
other airways?
yes.
You didn't have a telex machine, or
Well, as I
obviously
said,
well before computers.
Yes, well, as I said, we had the Reuters machine, which we nicked, and Voice of America, and we picked up from various from the BBC. There were not various stations in Britain. There was only the BBC. We picked up from them, and we did get the weather forecast from. We had it radioed in from somewhere, and I can't tell you where. I can't remember. But we didn't have official communications, if that was 1965. We didn't have official communications ship to shore anymore because the British government refused to allow us to use it. But we did have a stalwart member of our community, our radio community, a retired man, I think he was retired shipping man, yes, merchant shipping man, Bill Scadden, lovely man. He lived on the coast at Frinton-on-Sea, and he was a ham radio operator. I apologise to ham radio operators, but a lot of people know them as such, amateur radio operator correctly. And he used to be up and about at midnight, and we would send covert messages by amateur radio to him. Running out of water, needs more bread, this much bread, so much butter, and etc., etc. And it all come out under bonded stores the next day by tender. And then if we really needed something during the day or wanted to get a message out that something was wrong, we had a series of codes we would use between the records. So we'd be doing an announcement for a record or something, and at a certain time of day we would say, I can't even remember what we'd say, but it would be a perfectly innocuous phrase which would be picked up by people knowing they had to monitor at that certain time.
I believe there was one announcer who shall definitely remain nameless that used to ask for tea.
Yes, Johnny Walker, yes.
Ah, well, I wasn't going to
Yes, the disc jockey, not the bottle. Yeah, Johnny, I trained him for my sins. And Johnny came aboard the Olga Patricia, which was the Britain Radio England radio station, two stations on the one ship, the American one from Texas I mentioned briefly earlier. That was in mid-1966. And he was standing with me in the ship one day. We were talking about the fact that he had to change his name because the ship had a couple of American jingles that could be used, and he had a choice of a couple of names to take on according to which name was on the jingle, and he had a couple to choose from, and he said, I think I'll have to choose Johnny Walker. I don't like the other one. And I said, that's not a bad name, it's well known. He said, how should I spell it? I said, like the spelling on the bottle in your hand. The other one was Tommy Vance, whose name was not Tommy Vance, but he had the same choice presented to him. The name was already on a jingle when he was working in Canada, and he took it and he stuck with it ever since. The pirate radios were the biggest the biggest news story in the world at the time. On the day, the biggest news story in the world. All over the world. We were everywhere, on the news, on the television, on the radio, everywhere, in every newspaper, from one end of the world to the other. The effect exists today because the inheritance is there of what we started at the very beginning, and the artists and the music that has been generated by the fact of our having been there. Radio Caroline, in its heyday, in the early days, the ships were broadcasting to anything up to 34 million people in its primary area, English-speaking people, and in the hundreds of millions, including Western Europe and even Eastern Europe, and by the freak of some of the signals skipping across the water in parts of America, the other side of it, the Atlantic. It was an amazing and astonishing phenomenon which won't go away. 45 years on, it's still very much a part of people's lives, and it's making me hoarse thinking about it.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Colin.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me.
So we've really enjoyed it. It's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. And I've got to recognise, of course, some of the firms that I've used, the PAMs for the UK jingles that are, I believe, now owned by the East Anglian Productions. Recognise Radio London and Radio Caroline, their historical CDs for use of some of their clips. And also thanks to Keith Skews for his excellent book, Pop Went the Pirates, which I've got in front of me here. All too soon, it's the end of the programme.